socialism. And it's an issue that, well, first of all, I've had a little experience with it myself, because I grew up in socialist India. India was a socialist country. And during that whole time that India was a socialist country, and for me, it's a vague set of memories. I mean, we had to stand in line to get a ration card, because you had to ration the amount of sugar you could buy, or rice, or cooking oil. And the corruption that kind of seeps into every aspect of India, always paying somebody under. These are my childhood memories. This was Indian socialism. And in fact, when I came to America, kind of fleeing Indian socialism, you might say, the basic image of India in America was India was the begging bowl of the world. And some of you remember, your parents probably told you when you were younger, listen, Johnny, you better eat your food because there are millions of starving people in India. Now, interestingly, you probably don't say that to your kids. In fact, what you probably say to your kids is something more like this. Johnny, you better study really hard because there are millions of Indians waiting to take your job. So, India has had a kind of an evolution away from socialism. My wife, Debbie, who's here in the audience, is from Venezuela. Hey, Debbie, you want to say hi? So Venezuela, and I'll come back to this, has gone in the opposite direction. A once prosperous country, ultimately thick with resources, a tremendous amount of uranium and gold and minerals. Once the richest country in South America with the 4th highest per capita income in the world. A country that is actually dripping with oil, in which there are now gasoline lines, shortages. And so what you've seen is the way in which socialism kills. I mean, kills the country, destroys a state, makes it ultimately into. And this is the experience of the 20th century. It's really odd to me that we're even talking about socialism, because socialism appeared to have been decisively refuted, discredited, to use Reagan's terms, tossed on the ash heap of history. We thought it was done. In fact, I would say, if one takes a little bit of a longer view, that socialism is the most discredited idea in the world after slavery. Slavery is probably number 1, and socialism is number 2. And if you look at the deepest works on socialism, they are presented in Hayek, for example, The Road to Serfdom, kind of a telling title of Solzhenitsyn's work. Socialism is presented as a form of slavery. Now, interestingly, today, well, I guess we do have certain forms of slavery in the world. We have sex slavery. We have certain forms of forced captivity. But there's, as far as I know, no party in the world that is the pro-slavery party. We don't have a major party, certainly not in the United States, that says, you know, the thing about slavery, guys, is it was a really good idea. The implementation was always poor. But we have an idea for how to get it right this time. This time, we're going to do slavery right. Nobody says that. You can't say that. You would be immediately carried out in a straitjacket. But with socialism, people do say that. They say, we know that 50 years ago, 60% of the real estate on the planet was controlled by regimes calling themselves socialist. This is not just the entire Soviet bloc encompassing Eastern Europe, Romania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. This is not most of South America was socialist. Almost all of Africa went socialist in the aftermath of colonialism. Half of Asia, including, of course, China and India, the 2 largest countries, socialist. So really, more than half the human beings on the planet were living under a regime, in a sense, named after Karl Marx. Unbelievable. No man, except perhaps Jesus Christ, has had that kind of influence in history. And then this whole thing imploded. Boom. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Communist Party abolished itself. Eastern Europe disintegrated. The Berlin Wall came down. All the countries that were socialist began to run away from socialism, leaving only a few isolated outposts, North Korea, Cuba, now Venezuela. And that's pretty much it. That's all that's left, really. So socialism was vanquished, and it was vanquished by history, and it was vanquished by experience. Very rarely in the world can you actually compare two different systems to see which one works better. If I were to compare, say, what was happening in France with, let's just say, the Ming Dynasty in China, different people, different culture, it's really hard to compare. But with socialism, we actually have really good comparisons. We have North and South Korea. North Korea, socialist. South Korea, capitalist. Look at the result. South Korea is 50 times richer than North Korea. People in South Korea live for 10 years longer. So in every measure of human welfare, you can see capitalism's doing better. You look at East and West Germany, the same thing. Same people, same background, same language, same culture, just two rival economic systems. So there you are. History rarely gives us this kind of test case. So you would think that the argument was settled. But now in the 21st century, certainly if the collapse of socialism was the big story of the last century, you would have to say the revival of socialism, not just in some remote outpost, but here in America, represents one of the biggest stories of the 21st century. And the first question you have to ask is how is this even possible? For the first time, really in American history, we have a major party that is pulling in the direction of socialism. Now, I'm not saying they're all socialists, but think of it this way. If you think of a spectrum with free market capitalism on one side of the tug of war and full-scale socialism on this side, ask yourself this: in which direction are all the Democratic, including all the fellows who dropped out, including Hickenlooper and everybody else, which direction are they pulling in? Are they pulling in the free market direction, or are they pulling in the socialist direction? And the answer is obvious. They are all, even Biden. Now with Biden these days, you're not really sure. So whether or not you're for socialism, the first argument for the left is capitalism has a problem. The second argument of the socialists is that, guys, we're not following the Venezuelan model. We're not trying to become like North Korea. We recognize that there have been authoritarian, despotic forms of socialism in the world. What we want to do is we have a much nicer model, Scandinavian socialism. So you, Dinesh, have been trying to tell us that socialism doesn't work anywhere in the world. It does work in the land where everybody is named Sven. The Nordic countries. And Sven is not Hugo Chavez. He's not Nicolas Maduro. Sven is actually kind of a really nice guy. First of all, he's fashionably metrosexual. He goes to work in a suit on a bicycle. Sven, it's very appealing. He's a really nice guy. Sven socialism is our model, not Venezuelan socialism. So socialism does work somewhere. Hey, it works in Norway, works in Sweden, works in Denmark, works in Finland, and those are our models. And finally, I would say, if I was on the left, that there's a new form of socialism in America, very different from other forms. And that socialism I'm going to call identity socialism. It's a marriage of socialism with identity politics. Now you have to realize that this actually represents something very new, because for Marx and for traditional socialism, classic socialism if you want to call it that, society is divided into only two groups. Let's call them the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, i.e. the workers and the capitalists, or to put it more crudely, the rich and the poor. There's really only one line dividing society. That's the class line. That's the only line that matters. Everything else spins out of that. That's Marx. But we now have a socialism that says, actually, Marx kind of took too limited a view of things. In fact, society is divided 10 different ways. Not only the rich and the poor, but how about the black and the white? How about the gender line that separates men from women? How about the line that separates legal from illegal immigrants? How about the line that separates the straight from the gay? In other words, what we have is, we have all this identity politics over here, and so what the left is doing now, their socialism, is to take the old Marxist class division and multiply it by producing 8 other types of division and bringing them all together. And so the Democratic coalition then, for 2020, becomes a coalition of self-styled, identifying, and presumably victimized or oppressed groups. The Democrats are hoping we can put enough of those people together, adding them up, that we're going to get a majority. And here we come to the distinctive feature of American socialism. It's democratic socialism. It's not trying to install a dictator. The idea is, if we can get 51% of the people, then they have every moral right to tell the other 49% what to do. That's democracy. Now, the first question you have to ask is it democracy? Is that democracy? I mean, let's look at this group right here in this room. If we were to take a vote and assemble a majority of 51% of people in this room, and they decide, let us now confiscate the property of all the others in the room, let's say the 49, or it doesn't matter, let's say we have a majority of 99%, and they decide there's this one guy that we all want to gang up on, we're just going to go into his house and take his stuff, or her stuff. Would that be right? Is that morally legitimate? Is that what democracy means? So right away we have to sort of ask, where are we trying to go here? What is the objective? Now, I want to talk for a moment about Scandinavia and zoom into this a little bit more than is customary, because Scandinavia has become sort of the model European social insurance. And the question becomes, how do they actually do it in Scandinavia? What is the Scandinavian model actually? Is it socialism? Is it not socialism? Well, the answer is, Scandinavia is divided into 2 parts. They divide the creation of wealth from the distribution of wealth. 2 different things. The Scandinavians are very capitalist about wealth creation, and they are fairly socialist about wealth distribution. Let's talk about each of those for a moment. Wealth creation. Does Scandinavia have minimum wage laws? No. Does Scandinavia have high confiscatory corporate tax rates? No. They're no higher than the United States. Does Scandinavia impose financial transaction fees of the kind that Bernie Sanders has proposed? No. Does Scandinavia have a wealth tax? No. They tried some wealth taxes in Sweden, they got rid of them. Does Scandinavia propose an estate tax? Do they have estate taxes? When you die, do they take half of your estate? No. You can leave all of it to your kids. So what you have in Scandinavia is that we should not screw with the goose that lays the golden eggs. We need to create the wealth first. Notice how different that is, by the way, from the mood of the left here. Their idea is right away to impose all kinds of squeezes, regulatory squeezes, tax squeezes, wealth squeezes on the rich. The Scandinavians never demonize the rich. Have you ever heard of anyone denouncing the fat cats, the 1%? Look at that Sven. He's a Sven that has more than this Sven. No, they don't do that. They're all in it together. They're all Sven. So the point I'm trying to get at here, and it's a very important one, is that Scandinavia operates by what can be called the politics of the tribe. Politics of the tribe. They rely on tribal solidarity. We're all in it together. So once we've created the wealth, then we can impose schemes to distribute it. Interestingly, Scandinavia tried universal basic income, at least Finland did, an experiment, didn't like it, dumped it, got rid of it. The Scandinavian model is really simple. Everyone benefits, and everyone has to pay. In other words, this is not a soak the rich scheme. The highest tax rates in Scandinavia, 60, 70, and 80%, kick in on the middle class. If you make $50,000 in Scandinavian countries, you're in the 50% tax bracket. Not only are you at that rate, there's a 25% VAT tax on everything you buy, which is a regressive tax that hits the poor more than it hits the rich. The Scandinavians are into soaking the poor, and they don't make any bones about it. Their point is, if you want this package of benefits, we have the right to take half your stuff. Now, contrast this with the deceitful way in which people like AOC and we're not going to go after, they don't even have the guts to say they're going to go after the upper middle class. They go, we're going to go after the billionaires. There are 300 billionaires in America. We're going to go after the billionaires. So in other words, what you have in American, well, Scandinavian socialism is, I call it unification socialism. Everybody's in the same boat. American socialism is division socialism. Let's take society, divide it as many ways we can, intensify hatred toward the group that is being demonized. So intensify hatred, for example, of the black against the white, the illegal against the legal, the poor against the rich, the gay against the straight. And so what you get is this thing that's now called intersectionality, which I guess is a marriage of all these different types of divisions. I want to suggest that is the very and exact opposite of what they do in Scandinavia. They don't do that. Now, very interestingly, there is one place in the world where all these features of American socialism are in fact present. And that country is indeed Venezuela. I just want to tell you a little bit about the Venezuelan story because you'll see how closely, with almost eerie closeness, it parallels the American story. First, when Hugo Chavez came to power in 1998, he campaigned as a third-party man. He was essentially Venezuela's Obama. He said, I'm not a leftist. He was interviewed. He said, I'm not a socialist. No, no, no. He said, if you don't like what I'm doing, throw me out. I'm a moderate. His slogan, I kid you not, was hope and change. Hope and change. Hugo Chavez only started the Socialist Party in Venezuela in 2007, 8 years after he came in. It was a bit of a long-term plan, but the moment he did it, he started labeling everything in Venezuela made in socialism. So you walk into the grocery store, you pick up a carton of milk, made in socialism. Now, the way that Hugo Chavez created what happened in Venezuela, what's happened in Venezuela since, the first thing he did is he embraced identity politics. The first thing he said was, notice, I am not a white man. I am of indigenous stock. So right away, in a country that is very multiracial, that had not been free of racial problems, but racial problems were not in the forefront, Hugo Chavez began to racialize everything. He even began to attack the tradition of Miss Venezuela because he said too many of the models are European. He said, look, we have 2 of our Venezuelan ships that are named after Venezuelan beauty queens. He stripped those names off and he replaced them with 2 black women who supposedly raised the Venezuelan hero Simón Bolívar. What I'm getting at is Hugo Chavez dived right into identity politics. One of the great villains for Hugo Chavez, Columbus. How familiar is that? Go to Scandinavia and start denouncing Columbus. Nobody will know what you're talking about. They don't get it. They have nothing against Columbus. The only regret about Columbus is that he wasn't named Sven. The second thing that Hugo Chavez did, confiscate guns. Hugo Chavez goes, guns are very dangerous. The citizenry does not need guns. They had all kinds of clever commercials to convince people to voluntarily turn in their guns before the guns are forcibly confiscated. And the moment that they were forcibly confiscated, the state began to unleash its force against the population. How? Not just using the military, but using street thugs that are called colectivos. This is Venezuela's answer to Antifa. These street thugs are former criminals, do-nothings, losers. Anybody who signs up with the regime and says, I'm willing to be your henchman, okay, go out and beat people who are protesting against the regime. And the good news, you have guns, which we're going to give you, and they don't. So the confiscation of guns was planned as a means of disarming the population to strengthen the state and its hold on the population. Now, if you turn on the news, you see, oh, you know, Venezuela's starving, everybody's running away to Colombia, nobody has any food to eat. And to a degree, that's true. Debbie has an aunt in Venezuela, she has no food. She goes into the grocery store, it's completely empty except for 300 bottles of ketchup, which tellingly say, made in socialism. It now becomes a kind of stark reminder of what socialism does. But the interesting thing is not everybody in Venezuela is like that. The so-called Chavistas, the people who are in Chavez's regime, are living high on the hog. They get bouquets of flowers delivered to their house. They go eat in the Buddha bar in Caracas. The richest person in the country is the daughter of the now late Hugo Chavez. Net worth of his daughter, according to Forbes, over $2 billion. $2 billion. And all the Venezuelan generals are living high on the hog. And notice that, by the way, this is very familiar here. Look at the way that in this country, people like the Clintons, Al Gore has made $200 million. Now, look, I have never been one to attack people for being rich. I've never attacked Nancy Pelosi for being rich. Her husband is a very successful businessman. That's how she's got a lot of money. God bless her. I'm talking about people who make millions of dollars on a government salary. How do you pull that one off? Look at the Bidens. Look at the Biden family racket. It doesn't just involve Hunter Biden. Follow Biden's own look-alike brother. Look at the way that guy makes money. All these guys make money from politics, and a lot of it. We're talking about 40, 50, 100, 200 million dollars. Now I ask you this. Name one Scandinavian politician who has gone from 0 to $100 million on a government salary. I defy you to do it. No Scandinavian can do it. It's never happened in Scandinavia. They don't do that. But they do it in America, and they do it in Venezuela. So the parallel between Venezuelan and American socialism is actually a little eerie. It's eerily close, which means if we go in that direction, that's where we're going to end up.